Page 392, Part 36. The human being has to know that he or she cannot protect himself or herself from errors on the real way of the evolution, and that when he or she attempts to shield himself or herself from them, he or she only makes more errors, and furthermore, cannot learn that which he or she fundamentally should learn as a result of the errors. Part 37. All that the human being has to do in order to receive direct help from himself or herself is to nurture correct, healthy, good, and neutral, positive, equalized thoughts. Thus, it has been said since ancient times, quote, "Whoever tends and nurtures correct and good thoughts will also receive help from himself or herself." Yet exactly the correct, neutral, positive, equalized thinking is difficult for many human beings, because many barely know any longer how correct, healthy, and positive thoughts are created, tended, and nurtured. Often that only happens out of an extraordinarily overbearing arrogance, and because the human being is not ready to look out for help and simply rejects offered help, and his or her own knowledge, understanding, and ability is mistakenly overvalued, or simply because the human being is too sluggish, or the consciousness and its thoughts are so occupied with nonsensical, useless, and destructive questions, distractions, pleasures, and circumstances, as well as detours, that it has a completely estranging effect on thoroughly contemplating the rightness or wrongness of matters. Thus, a turnaround can only arise when the human being consciously turns to correct, positive thinking and admits to himself or herself that he or she continually pursued wrong views and delusions, and, in fact, requires his or her own inner help in order to free himself or herself from the unfortunate work of his or her negative entanglements. Part 38. If the human being is a negativist, imprisoned in pessimistic thoughts, and is consequently destructive, devolutive, unproductive, lacking ideas, unartistic as well as uncreative and unimaginative, and so forth, then he or she is convinced that everything always fails for him or her, and the world will deteriorate. However, he or she must counter that with all real and positive means, and must never slacken in his or her intentional, forward-directed efforts, and those directed at that which is higher. At the beginning of such efforts, it may look at first as if striving forward would be impossible, and would become ever more difficult. But when one simply looks beyond that, and guides one's thoughts away from these gloomy, illusory pictures, then the human being emerges from this procedure entirely changed, and changed for the better. If feelings must thereby be controlled, or neutral positively equalized and steered in evolutive forms, or for some necessary reasons subdued or shut down, then it is necessary to fundamentally direct the thoughts in these forms, because the feelings can only be created and influenced through them, because, by means of the might of the thoughts, everything of which the human being ever conceives and allows to become, the ideals, the imaginations, and wishes and other efforts, and ultimately the setting of Ziele, bears fruit. Whenever doubts surface in any form, they must simply be regarded and treated as that which they actually are, namely, only obstacles on the way of one's development toward that which is higher. These obstacles must be given both the necessary respect as well as the required understanding, which calls for everything having to be analyzed, clarified, and uncramped, as well as understood. The human being must always thereby be clear that, with an obstacle, one is not dealing with a fundamentally insoluble problem, rather solely with a further step in the process of development, in the alteration of the inner values and in the reformation of the personality. And precisely this process must always be carried on and be allowed to continue to run its course, until the point at which the process which was begun reaches its conclusion, and the set end Ziel is achieved. However, after that, the evolution goes even further, ever further. Consequently, new things must be learned, and new Ziel settings must be brought forth. It is thereby necessary that one's trust in oneself, and one's decisiveness, enthusiasm, and hope are never lost. That is the path which all evolutive human beings have taken since ancient times, and will also take in the future, because actually no other possibility for the evolution exists. But in every case, included in that are also the persistence and perseverance, which are extraordinarily important factors, without which a Ziel can never be achieved. Part 39. If, in the face of death, and at the moment of dying, the human being succeeds in directing his or her consciousness and his or her thoughts and impulsations at the creational existence in order to unite with it and to die in peace, then he or she has lived his or her life in truthfulness of the fulfillment of the creational natural laws and recommendations. Therefore, it is the human being's task, during his or her life, to work his or her way up, in his or her consciousness and in his or her thoughts, to such a degree that he or she merges, in the possible consciousness forms, with the wisdom power of the creational spirit, and the life he or she leads in accordance with the creationally given laws and recommendations becomes self-evident for him or her, whereby the powers of the spirit penetrate into his or her entire way of thinking, and into his or her striving, the management of his or her life, and into his or her actions and evolving. However, this is a long process, which requires lifelong efforts, from which all progressive things, as well as knowledge and wisdom and so forth, accumulate and become an enormous might factor in the human being, which he or she can make useful for himself or herself and his or her fellow human beings at any time as he or she desires. All perceptions become recognized as appearances of reality, and are also handled, processed, and evaluated in this form, whereby all life situations, and all that goes with them, are recognized as facts necessary for evolution, regardless of whether they are tragic or senseless, terrifying, revealing, or, in the best measure, forward-looking, and of a positive kind. In every case, they are always values from which much can be learned, and one's entire life can be evolutively formed. Part 40. When the human being's consciousness shines with wisdom, then springing forth from that are the growing thoughts and feelings of the immense, unshakable certainty of the conviction that the life in the material existence and in the being of the all-great time are inseparably connected to each other, and are of a creational nature. Consequently, there is nothing else for which to search or hope which would equal this creationally given life. One must constantly search for, tend, and nurture this certainty by means of a constantly repeated view and a look into the depths of the nature of the consciousness, by means of a disciplined meditation, so that the human being is always conscious of the true greatness of life. Part 41. Many who are uneducated in the teaching of the creational laws and recommendations ask themselves, quote, "Who is the human being's inner teacher?" The inner teacher is nothing other than one's inner nature, which the human being forms according to his or her own choosing, and thereby builds the form of his or her consciousness and thereby his or her personality, which is normally also expressed outwardly, however, is very often conveyed to others in a falsified form for one's own advantage and in demand for profit. If the human being does not form his or her inner nature according to the form of his or her innermost creationally given nature, rather only according to his or her own advantage-based sense, then a selfish Wesenheit, that is to say, personality, arises, which, as a false inner teacher, causes the human being to have a devolutive and self-disadvantaging effect in the inner and the outer. If the inner nature, that is to say, the inner teacher, is formed true to the laws in accordance with the wisdom of the innermost nature, the innermost teacher of the human being, and is equipped with the innermost values of the creational energy-based impulses, then neutral positive equalized values arise, which are also released outwardly in the same form, and reveal to the fellow human beings the real nature of the inner teacher. And allowing the real and truthful knowledge and the wisdom of the inner teacher, of the inner nature, and of the actual personality to become outwardly observable, audible, and effective in the environment is the result of the setting of Seele in the material realm of life. The form in which the result manifests then also determines whether one's inner peace, love, joy, and freedom, as well as harmony, have in fact arisen in full measure and can consequently also be expressed outwardly without a lessening of the relevant created capabilities. Therefore, even if the human being wants, oh so very much, to shield his or her inner nature, his or her inner teacher, from the observations of other human beings, everything taught by the inner teacher comes to light anyway, as external manifestations, and reveals the secret of one's own inner self and the inner truth. Therefore, the human being who has become righteous because of his or her inner teacher behaves freely and openly, and also allows the effects of his or her inner nature to penetrate outwardly in unaltered form.